Okay, hello everyone. Welcome. My name is Attorney Bernadette Stark, and I'm the Director of the Student Legal Services Office. And on behalf of the Student Legal Services Office, I want to say hello and welcome to our seminar on the $1,200 stimulus payment and international students. For those of you who don't know, the Student Legal Services Office is an on-campus resource available for students. If you are a fee-paying student of UMass, you are entitled to free legal services through our office. One of the practice areas that we handle is immigration and working with international students. And we wanted to bring this informational seminar because we have received a lot of questions around this issue. And we thought it would be helpful. So we'll kind of get right into it, but I'd like to introduce myself and my co-presenter. As I said, my name is Bernadette Stark. I'm currently the Director of the Student Legal Services Office. I'm a practicing attorney. I've been practicing for over 18 years in the areas of family law and immigration. I work largely with international students here on campus in providing legal advice, representation, and education about their rights. I'm here with Mr. Brandon O'Donnell, who has 10 years experience as a certified public accountant, and he is currently at the firm of Boycell, Morton, and Wolkowitz, where he provides tax advice to businesses and individuals. We're going to try to have a discussion portion to this presentation. We want to cover some of the most common questions that we've received in the office, and leave some time at the end for a question and answer period. We'll open it up through the chat function for questions. If you have questions during the presentation, please feel free to type them up in the chat room. We have a moderator who will be presenting the questions to us either during the presentation or at the end. We will try our best to answer as many questions that we have. We also want to make sure everyone understands that every situation is different. You each have unique circumstances and unique facts. So the purpose of this seminar is to provide as much general legal and tax information as possible, but it does never take the place of having a professional review your particular taxes in your particular situation. So let's get right into it. So as many of you know, as a result of the coronavirus pandemic, the US legislature, the federal government, on March 27, 2020, passed something called the CARES Act, which was the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act. And under that act, the government provided stimulus payments in the amount of $1,200, referred to as recovery rebates, which are technically tax credits, advanced tax credits for the year 2020. Now, these direct payments have been directly deposited into the accounts of individuals who filed taxes in the previous years, although some people are receiving paper checks as well. But the receipt of these payments is dependent on your taxes that you filed most recently, either 2018 or 2019. And the amount of your payment would also be based on information from your last tax return. It's important to note that non-resident aliens are not eligible for any payment under the CARES Act. So generally, F1s, J1s, unless they meet certain requirements, are not eligible for these payments. However, the government has been sending payments, sometimes correctly because of how people filed taxes in the previous year, and sometimes incorrectly. So we want to try to cover as many of those contingencies as we can and see what's helpful for you. The Act also excludes non-resident aliens, and that's the language of the statute, and households in which any member does not have a Social Security number. So as a result, even if there's someone in your household with a Social Security number, you still may not be eligible for the $1,200 stimulus payment. Now, some international students can qualify as resident aliens for tax purposes, and as such would be eligible for these payments based on how long they've been physically present in the United States. Generally, H-1Bs are considered residents for tax purposes, but not for immigration purposes, and there is a distinction. We're going to try to cover that for you. Many international students have their taxes prepared by others, and many students in general. And in many cases, a lot of students aren't necessarily sure of their proper tax status. So this, compounded with the errors currently occurring in the Internal Revenue Service, has contributed to a lot of errors in the distribution of these checks, as well as creating a lot of confusion, particularly for international students. So that's where the certified public accountant comes in. Then this is more of a tax issue than a legal issue. Mr. O'Donnell is going to cover some of the most common questions we received. But first, we've asked that he just give us an overview on the various tax filing statuses for international students. Thank you, Brandon.
Great. Thank you so much for having me, and welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us today. And this surely has been a confusing time. You know, many people are incorrectly receiving the payments. There are deceased taxpayers that are receiving payments. Some taxpayers have received multiple payments. And on the flip side, taxpayers who are eligible, international students who are here in the United States who are eligible, are still waiting for the money to come in. And given these economic times, $1,200 is a substantial amount of money. So we're here to help and hopefully answer some of the questions today. And just to give a little background, you know, so a lot of this confusion has stemmed from the fact of how international students, we're going to focus particularly on F1 visas, how are they supposed to be filing to begin with, which is one thing that we're going to address right now. So if you are an F1 visa student here in the United States, generally speaking, you're going to be filing what's known as Form 1040-NR. And so this is for non-resident individuals, and non-resident in the sense of whether or not you're a taxpayer, tax status here in the United States. So if you are an F1 visa holder, and if you've been in the United States for less than 5 years, you are automatically deemed to be a non-resident for tax purposes, unless you meet other requirements that could help you obtain the stimulus payment. And the number one issue was going to come up is whether or not you would have a work-eligible Social Security number. On the other hand, U.S. citizens, resident aliens would file what's known as a Form 1040, which is a traditional United States tax return. And Attorney Stark mentioned the substantial presence. That can be a factor in whether or not somebody's considered a resident versus a non-resident. Just to give you a little background on that, to be considered a resident based on substantial presence testing, you have to be in the United States for at least 183 days in the past 3 years. And that includes the year of testing. So if you're looking to find out whether or not you are considered a resident based on physical presence tests in 2020, which is the threshold for the stimulus payment, you have to be considered a resident for 2020. You would count all the days you've been present here in the United States for 2020. You would include 1/3 of the days you were here in 2019, and you would include 1/6 of the days you were here in 2018. So I assume for the majority of you, you all would meet that substantial presence test, especially if you are, you know, junior, even sophomore, junior, senior. You're going to meet that presence test here in the United States. So one other thing to keep in mind too is that the U.S. tax code, the IRS wants to deem you as a resident, because when you're considered a resident of the United States for tax purposes, the IRS will tax your worldwide income. Even income you've generated from your home country, the IRS will tax that here and give you a tax credit for any taxes you paid to your for your home country. Versus if you're a non-resident for tax purposes, the United States will only tax your United States sourced income. So there's a distinction there that I just wanted to make sure was clear to everyone. And from this point on, I think I'll give it back to Attorney Stark, we're going to run through some of the most common questions that have come up so far.
Okay, thank you. So, Brandon, one of the questions that our office has received probably the most is from students who've used a company or TurboTax, H&R Block to file taxes, to prepare taxes and file them on their behalf, and who are now worried that they filed incorrectly. So perhaps you could talk a little bit about that issue and what do they do if they learn that the taxes have been filed incorrectly.
Sure, and the most common example where something might be filed incorrectly is that if a student's here on an F1 visa has a tax identification number instead of a Social Security number, they should be filing Form 1040 NR. And if they were to file a Form 1040, this is where they might have incorrectly received a stimulus payment, and we'll address how to return that later. But if that did happen to you, what you should do is reach out to the company that you worked with to prepare your 2019 or 18 taxes that need to be amended. Let them know your concerns and have them work through it. Now, if you used an online service, an H&R Block Online or a TurboTax Online, you might seek professional help from a local accountant in your area. If you're still in the Amherst area, you could seek a local CPA here or for wherever you are located right now. So
Okay.
that would be the best bet. And by correcting it, whether it's correcting it to make you eligible for a stimulus or correcting it to make you ineligible, that's one thing you want to do as soon as possible to get that taken care of.
Okay. What about international students that are here on an F1? Does the substantial presence test apply to F1 students? For example, they're considered a non-resident for tax purposes, but they've been here for a substantial enough period of time. What do those people do?
Yeah, in that scenario, in order to be eligible for the stimulus, we're still going to need a work eligible Social Security number. That'd be first and foremost. So that's going to drive some issues. If you don't have work eligible Social Security number, this would make you ineligible, unfortunately, for this $1,200 stimulus payment.
Okay, so first step, determine whether you have a Social Security number, then you would look at the substantial presence test?
Yes.
Okay, all right. Now, let's say students are have received a stimulus check. What should they do?
Sure. So if they believe they are eligible and have confirmed that, fantastic. It's their money to keep and use as they need. For those students that might have received, let's say, a paper check first, and they know they're not eligible, the best thing to do is actually return it to the IRS. Last week, the IRS came out with some guidance on how to return a paper check, and I believe we're going to post a link in the chat that will give you the address to mail it in. But basically, what you're going to want to do is on the back of the check where you normally would endorse it for deposit, you're going to want to write void there and attach a brief memo stating the fact that you're returning your stimulus payment because you're ineligible. On the other hand, if you received a direct deposit or a check that you've cashed, you're actually going to have to repay that to the IRS, that $1,200. So you're going to write a check out to the Internal Revenue Service or the Department of Treasury, and same thing, you're going to want to mail this back to the IRS. We're going to include a link in the chat for the address on where to send that payment, but you're going to want to send that back as soon as possible because we don't want to accumulate any interest and penalties, and also have any issues going forward with immigration status or coming back here to the States. So, and one thing to note, in the event you might have been ineligible for this stimulus payment, Congress is currently working on a second round of stimulus, and there's a big push to include all people into the second round of the $1,200 payments. So here's to hoping that we'll have an inclusive payment this time and that doesn't leave people out in the second round if that happens.
Okay. I'm seeing some questions in the chat with respect to what if someone on an F1 has U.S. citizen children. My understanding is even if there is someone with a Social Security number in the household, that doesn't necessarily make the person eligible, but can you confirm and or add to that?
Yeah, my current understanding is it has to be at the taxpayer level first. So they are giving a $500 additional stimulus payment for all children in the household under 17 years of age at December 31st, 2019. In the event that the taxpayer or spouse does not have a work eligible Social Security number, unfortunately that would make the whole stimulus ineligible for that household.
Okay. Let's see here. So you talked a little bit about returning a paper check. Can you go a little bit into details on how exactly someone would do that?
Sure. Yeah. So that on the back of the check, the individual would want to write void where they normally would sign for deposit. And then you would include a brief memo just with your name, address, taxpayer identification number, and just states the IRS that you plan on returning this payment because you're ineligible. And we've included that link in the chat on where to mail that. It's based on where you have resided in the United States, which I assume most of you are Massachusetts based. So you actually mail back the check if you haven't cashed it. And then if you have cashed it, you would write them a check and return that. And with the link that we're including, it's going to be question 48 from the IRS that you're going to want to look for. It's actually the last Q&A that's included on the link that we've included in the chat box.
Okay, so for those of you who are monitoring the chat, one of our moderators is going to post some information as well as a link on how to return those payments. What if someone received a direct deposit with the stimulus payment and they believe that they've received that payment incorrectly? What can they do?
Sure, very similar to if you received a paper check that you have not cashed. For direct deposit would be the same way. You would write the IRS a check for $1,200 and return that to the same address that we're going to include on that link. So they would be expecting repayment of that. It's not something that we can correct in 2020 to repay it. It's something that needs to be repaid as soon as possible.
Okay. So I'm seeing in the chat also that a lot of questions with respect to whether someone as an F1 student qualify for the substantial resident time. And maybe some people have joined us after. Would you mind kind of reviewing the requirements for the substantial presence test and clarify what the concrete requirements are for someone to be eligible to file as a resident for tax purposes?
Sure. And just a reminder, even if you met the substantial presence test without the work eligible Social Security number, you're still going to be ineligible, unfortunately, for this payment. But so the substantial presence test, as with most things with the IRS, is more complicated than it needs to be. So it's a test that looks back. It's a 3-year period. So if we're going to test whether or not you were a resident for 2020, we would count the days through today, May 14th, how long you've been here in 2020. And then we also then would include 1/3 of the days from 2019. And we would include 1/6 of the days that you were here in 2018. But if you've been here, if you've been at UMass for a semester or two last year, and then have been here all of 2020, you're going to meet that test. And you're going to meet that test once we get through to July, because you're going to meet that 183-day requirement. So if you're going to be here for all of 2020, you will be a resident for 2020 tax purposes, because the due date for the tax return is now July 15th, which was pushed up from April 15th. So if you're going to be here for all of 2020 through the due date of the return, you will be considered a resident for the substantial presence testing.
Okay. And can you define for students what a work eligible Social Security number means?
You know, that was something I just pulled from the regs.
I could actually talk to that a bit. So some students have Social Security numbers, and some which is obtained pursuant to a request for work authorization or an EAD. So if you have an EAD card or work authorization with a Social Security number that says valid for work authorization only, that is a SSN work eligible Social Security number. However, if you have a Social Security number on a card that says not valid for employment, then that does not qualify. So on your Social Security card, there will be, if you're not yet a lawful permanent resident or a citizen, there will be information there with respect to whether it's work eligible or not.
Thanks for clarifying that. That's helpful too. And I think maybe one other thing just to bring up while we're discussing the stimulus payment is, if you meet, let's say you're a resident, you meet the residency test, whether it's you have a green card or you have substantial presence. Let's assume you have the Social Security number that makes you eligible. There are other thresholds, which, you know, given that most of you are students, whether if you're undergraduate, especially if you make under 75,000, you're going to get a full $1,200 stimulus. But if you're single, not married, and let's say your income for 2019 was $100,000, you wouldn't get the stimulus just based on your income levels too. So there are other factors that weigh into this. I think we're assuming that most of our audience is under the $75,000 a year income, but just wanted to throw that out there as well, that there is an income limitation to this program as well.
We've received a lot of questions in the chat. Would you like for me to go down through them just to make sure that they all get answered?
Sure.
So the first one is, can you clarify the requirements for filing as a resident alien as an F1 student? You become, this is a longer question. You become a resident alien after 5 years, correct? If 2019 taxes were filed as a resident alien before March, is the student eligible for stimulus? So I think the question is, can you clarify the requirements for filing as a resident alien as an F1 student?
So once again, the first thing to remember is this only applies to people who have work eligible Social Security numbers. So regardless of how long you're physically present in the United States, you're not eligible unless you have that. So assuming you have that, Mr. O'Donnell, what's the answer there? Yeah,
so the 5 year is an exception to filing and being deemed a resident for tax purposes, because they, in theory, if you're here for an F1 visa, we're here for college, or maybe we have overseas teachers here that are here for maybe a year or two teaching, but they don't plan to stay here. So they give F1 visas that 5 year exemption because they assume you're going to have 5 tax periods if you are here for a full undergraduate term. You don't have to use the exception. You can then deem yourself as a resident for tax purposes. One thing you're going to want to think about is if you have income or investments out of the country, if you're going to deem yourself to be a resident of the United States for income tax purposes in order to get the stimulus payment, we're going to want to make sure that you're not increasing your overall tax liability by maybe claiming some income from your home country that's going to exceed that $1,200 benefit anyway. So that's one factor to consider. But yes, you could be a resident for tax purposes even in your 3rd year of being here on an F1 visa.
So to make sure, if the Social Security, the SSN card says valid for work only with DHS authorization, does it mean they have a work eligible SSN card or not?
Yes, they have a work eligible SSN card if it says valid for work only with DHS authorization. If it says not valid for employment, then it's not work eligible. Any other questions, Raquel?
Yeah, there's a lot of them. When you say that if the F1 student has stayed for 5 years, does that mean that if 2020 tax year is the 5th year, should they file as a resident alien?
If they were to meet the substantial presence test, then yes, they would file in that 5th. It would be in their 6th tax year they would file as a resident. If they were electing to use the first 5 years as the exemption from filing as a resident, it would be their 6th tax year that they would file, so not in the 5th.
Okay. I received a direct deposit and have an SSN since 2017. I also qualify under the presence test. I did, however, file using TurboTax. What should I do in this case?
So it's correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds like they're eligible, they filed on TurboTax, and they have not received the direct deposit yet?
They didn't say.
Okay, so assuming that you haven't received the direct deposit and you were eligible, you filed your tax return and you're waiting, most of the time you haven't received the funds because when you filed your 2019 or 18 tax return, you might not have included your bank information in with your tax return when it was finalized. So at that point, you actually would want to go to the IRS website and you can search, where's my stimulus? And from there is a link where you can actually view when the check will be mailed to you. Because as of tomorrow, they'll be doing no more direct deposits. It's all going to be paper checks from here on out. I just checked for a client yesterday who was waiting for their check to come through, and hers is getting mailed out tomorrow, May 15th, which is, I guess, when the majority of those checks are going to be mailed out. And what's happening is they're mailing them out to the last address known on your tax return. So whatever the most recent return you filed, that's the address it's going to go to. So in the event you might have moved from there, you might want to notify a prior landlord or friend where you were staying that you might have some mail coming.
Okay. I did my taxes. I filed them as a resident alien after checking my presence. I have been here for 4 years now. What should I do? Should I refile my taxes and give the check back?
No, in that circumstance, without that valid Social Security number, if you didn't receive the stimulus as planned, you actually need to return the funds. So if you haven't cashed the check yet, you would return the check. If you receive direct deposit or if you cash the check for $1,200, you need to write a check back to the Internal Revenue Service for $1,200 and return that payment. And I know somewhere in the link we do have the address for where to mail that payment. But unfortunately, without a valid Social Security number, if you did receive that stimulus payment, that does need to be returned.
So
oh, go ahead. Sorry.
One of the questions we received, just as a clarification, and this was relating to the TurboTax question, is if TurboTax, H&R Block, or some other tax preparer filed a 1040 on behalf of the individual instead of the 1040 NR, I think people want a little bit more explanation about what they do, how to file an amended tax return in that situation.
Got it. And so, yes, if you use an online software similar to H&R Block or TurboTax, you can amend it right through that software platform. What you would do is if you filed a 1040, you would need to go through the process of filing as a non-resident on a 1040 NR. And logistically, it'd be too much to go through on this webinar, but you would want to work, you would go through the process through TurboTax to amend. From my experience, a lot of people have hired an external accountant to prepare that for them. But TurboTax honestly does a good job of walking you through the amended steps of how you go about filing a 1040 NR. And at that point, you would file a 1040 NR. If you've already received the stimulus, you would send it back in that event. If you haven't received it yet, when you file a 1040 NR, it's going to make you ineligible for that stimulus regardless.
And I'd like to talk, I know that we are getting a lot of questions about people's individual circumstances, and we'll try to make some room at the end for those very specific questions. I want to make sure that we talk about some of the broader questions as well and some of the concerns people have. One of the reasons we're emphasizing the importance of returning monies that were provided to you that were not supposed to be provided to you is because not only of the taxes, fees, and penalties, but the potential immigration consequences. Now, just to clarify, there aren't going to be any consequences with respect to your CVIS record. IPO is not involved. They don't report anything. It's purely a tax issue. However, if you wanted to adjust status for immigration purposes, either through lawful permanent residency, or if you wanted to get an H-1B, that's the kind of thing that can come back and be an obstacle in the petition. You want to be very, very careful. Save all records, save all correspondence that you provide to or receive from the IRS for a couple of years to make sure that if there is an issue down the road that you have documentation with respect to that. Mr. O'Donnell, we've also been getting questions with respect to what happens if there's a change in their status. So if someone's tax status changes to resident alien on July 2nd, but the tax status beginning date is listed as January 1st, 2020, is that person considered a resident alien? Can they receive a stimulus check?
Yeah, my current understanding is that it is yes, but it will be dependent on meeting the test, which was going to come through. You know, if we're still here on July 3rd, given that the tax return is due until July 15th, if they were to wait until July to file a 1040, that would make them eligible for the stimulus for 2019. In the event that they have already filed a 1040 NR for 2019, when they file a 2020 tax return this time next year, they will then get the stimulus, because this, as you mentioned in our introduction, this is actually an advanced tax credit. So anybody that didn't get this that is eligible will get it in 2020. Granted, it's a year from now, but you will still be eligible and entitled to those funds. This is an advanced tax credit because they're trying to get money in people's hands given the economic climate. But under that, with those understanding, I believe that they would be eligible in 2020 to receive it, because they would be considered a resident for tax purposes by the due date of the return, which is July 15th this year.
Okay. What about students who may have been here in the last year and have either left the country, temporarily, permanently, but are no longer present in the U.S., yet they've received the stimulus payment? What happens in that situation?
Yeah, so my current understanding, based on guidance that we have, is that you have to be considered a resident for tax purposes in 2020, meaning if you're filing your 2019 tax return, you would need to file a 1040, have a valid Social Security number, and be in the United States for at least 31 days in 2020. And if you were to leave after that point, then yes, that would make you would still be eligible to receive the payment. Same thing for U.S. citizens that are working abroad; they're still eligible to receive the payment. So if you are qualified to file a 1040 for 2019, you will be eligible to receive those payments, because the test year is 2020. In the event that you left in early 2019 and you received a stimulus based on your 2018 return, unfortunately, my understanding is you're supposed to return that, but I have not had final guidance, and the IRS is supposed to be updating that guidance in the next week or two.
Feel free to keep the questions coming. We have about 25 more minutes. We want to try to have those answered for you if we can. So one of the questions that I've just received was, if an international student is eligible for the stimulus, can it still affect immigration in the future? And I believe that question is going to the concern about the public charge rule that was issued recently. And the answer is no, it should have no impact or be considered as a part of the public charge payment or benefit received, because it's, as Mr. O'Donnell said, it's a tax credit. It's an advanced tax credit. So it's something that you would do on your taxes in the following year. It's not a benefit or a payment made by the government on your behalf. So it will not have any impact on your immigration status in the future or your ability to adjust status. Another question I see, I'm a resident alien with an F1 visa. My wife is a non-resident alien with an F1, and my son is born in the United States. Both my wife and I have Social Security numbers and work as TAs at UMass. We file taxes jointly. Are we all eligible? I think maybe there's some confusion about eligibility within a household. If you can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, if both the taxpayers have the work eligible Social Securities and they're filing a 1040, and the dependent has a Social Security number, then they would be eligible for $1,200 each plus a $500 credit for the dependent. And I believe you mentioned both were resident aliens?
One says one is a resident alien with a wife that's a non-resident alien.
You know, to be honest, I don't have the answer to that question. I'm not sure.
Okay, that's something we can look up. I would encourage Folks, if you have a question that isn't answered today, or if we say we need to look into that a little bit more and try to get back to you, please feel free to fill out an intake for services at SLSO. We have a website with a link. I'll ask that the moderator put it in the chat room. You can fill out an intake with our office, and then we can investigate your particular situation if a question wasn't answered here today, provided that it's a legal question. If it's a tax question, we can still help you with a referral to a tax professional who might be able to answer that question. There's another request that we explained again, the situation for people that have filed taxes in 2018 and 2019 but have left the country recently. Would you address that again, please?
Yeah, sure. So based on current regulations, you have to be a resident for tax purposes in 2020 to receive the stimulus. So you would have to be in the United States for 31 days in 2020, which is the minimum you would need to be considered to meet that substantial presence test. It would be 31 days in 2020. And then if you were here for all of 2019 or part of 2019 and 2018, that would give you a substantial presence test. So without that, if you left in early 2019 and filed a 2018 return and received a stimulus, based on current guidance, you are ineligible to receive a stimulus, because the IRS isn't aware that you left the country yet. They probably assume you just haven't filed your tax return yet. So that's where some of the confusion has come in as well.
Okay.
And also just to add, for students that are here and meet all the requirements but never filed a tax return, so we'll assume you have the Social Security number, you're a resident for tax purposes, nobody can claim you as a dependent, you make under $75,000. So assuming you make nothing, you're not automatically going to get this. You actually need to go on the IRS website to get my stimulus. If you Googled IRS get my stimulus, there is a link where you actually put in your identification numbers, your address, and they will send you a check. Because this is pretty common for taxpayers who might not file because they don't make enough money to file or are required to file, or for people who don't have any earned income in the United States. But if you have a Social Security number and you don't file a tax return, you need to notify the IRS that you are eligible for the payment. So there is the other side of this. You might have some students that didn't have a filing requirement but are still eligible to receive the payment. You don't have to have earned income to receive the payment. Just wanted to bring that point up as well.
Okay. Does it make a difference whether, if someone's income is only from the United States, the question I have is, does it make a difference if one files it as a 1040 or a 1040 NR? My understanding is that sounds like just asking you to redefine the differences between 1040 or 1040 NR and whether or not income exclusively from the United States factors in.
Yeah, the source of income doesn't factor in there. It's whether or not they are considered a resident for tax purposes. You know, that's with whether you're a citizen, a green card holder, or substantial presence test. That would be your 1040, and then the 1040 NR is for everybody else that is considered a non-resident for tax purposes. But your sources of income don't impact which form you file.
Okay. If someone started living in the United States in the fall of 2018, has a work-eligible Social Security number, and filed a 1040 NR in both 2018 and 2019, are they eligible for the stimulus?
Not if they filed a 1040 NR, and if that was the correct way to do it. If they were a tax resident, they would need to go back and amend that 1040 NR, file a 1040 for both years, and then they would become eligible for the payment.
Okay. For those monitoring the chat, there is a question with respect to the Social Security card saying valid for work authorization only with INS authorization, and it says INS instead of DHS. All that means is that it's a very old card. INS is the the agency that used to administer immigration petitions, authorizations in this country, the Immigration and Naturalization Service. It was replaced by the Department of Homeland Security in the restructuring after September 11, 2001. So whether it says INS or DHS, it still has the same effect legally. Again,
really quickly, there was a moment earlier in response to the question, I am a resident alien with an F1 visa. My wife is a non-resident alien F1 and my son is born in the US. Both my wife and I have social security numbers and work as TAs at UMass. We filed our taxes jointly. Are we all eligible? There was something about that question that you were unsure about. There's someone in the chat asking if you could clarify which part you were unsure about.
It was the non-resident status of a spouse. That, in theory, would make the payment ineligible for everybody involved, unless the other spouse, the taxpayer, was military. So both spouses have to be residents for tax purposes and have a valid social security number, as far as I'm aware, as of now.
mm-hmm.
Even if the non-resident has a work eligible social security number?
I think that goes back to that might be one of these questions we'll have to follow up with. And if that student wants to put in a claim with the student legal office, then we can follow up with that at a later date.
Thank you.
I'd be happy to look into that.
I think that one is one of the very narrow situations that need some research, because it falls in between. On the one hand, a work eligible social security number is there, but on the other hand, the Act specifically excludes non-residents, and it's not the primary, it's a member of the household. So we would be very happy to research that and provide you more information to that situation. Is it possible to return the stimulus payments in installments?
As far as I'm aware, no. As of now, the IRS wants it back as a full payment, whatever you receive, so then they can match it back up to the payment that went out. So like I mentioned before, most of you would have received the full $1,200, so they have that coded under your taxpayer identification number or social security number, and the best way to send it back would be in full. But there isn't guidance on an installment plan as of now.
Okay. A lot of the questions we have, and we apologize for people who are kind of tuning in for new stuff. We're just going through the questions right now in the chat room. So if you have any questions, we have about 5 minutes left. But another question with respect to the substantial presence test, and I really appreciate you fielding all of these, Brandon. This one says, I'm in F1 visa, I passed the substantial presence test, and I have a work authorization SSN, but I haven't stayed in the US 5 years yet until this September 2020. They did file a 1040 tax return for 2019. Is this person eligible for the stimulus check?
Yeah, based on that fact pattern, it sounds like they are, because as we mentioned before, one of the exceptions for F1 students who are here is to be deemed as a non-resident for tax purposes, and that's because they don't want to tax that student's possible investment income or other income from their home country. So, but you can use the substantial presence tests, which it sounds like you meet, and you filed a 1040 in 2019 with a valid social security number. That would make you eligible for this payment. And I'm not sure whether or not that student received it already, but if not, I would check the IRS website, Google IRS, where's my stimulus? And there's a nice, very user-friendly software where you can log in, put in your social security number, put in your last known address, and then you can check the status of when they're going to send you the payment if they have not done so already. Excellent.
Can you talk a little bit about what a tax credit is? One of the questions we received is it accurate to say that the stimulus payment will be deducted from people's tax returns next year?
So this is an advanced tax credit. So for people that received it correctly, if they were eligible and received it, this will have no impact on their 2020 tax return. If they were eligible and never received it, they will then get that $1,200 tax credit when they file their 2020 tax return. As far as I'm aware, if they were ineligible, they received it, and they're going to then file a 2020 tax return, we believe that you'll be able to repay it on your 2020 tax return, but we don't recommend waiting until then. We mentioned potential immigration or visa issues, but also there might be penalties and interest involved. But we would expect the IRS to allow taxpayers that inadvertently received the $1,200 to repay that on the 2020 tax return, but we haven't had any official guidance yet.
Okay. Now here's a pretty in-depth fact pattern. I'll keep lobbing them at you. This student is here on a J1 visa as an exchange student. They previously worked in the United States in 2018 and 1 week in 2019. The company that they worked for told them to submit a 1040 form for 2018, but no advice was given for 2019. So the person submitted a 1040, assuming that was the correct way. They would have been working in the US for 183 days total. Would that person be eligible?
Not if they were not a resident for 2020. So if this fact pattern ended in the beginning of 2019, my current understanding is that no, they need to be a resident for the U.S. for income tax purposes in 2020, because we got to think about what this payment really is. This is an economic stimulus payment for hardship that's happening right now in the United States. So this is focused for people that are here in theory or were here for the beginning part of this year. So if they left in 2019 and weren't a tax resident for 2020, I believe they're ineligible for the payment.
Okay. This is a slight distinction from something that you talked about previously. If an F1 student has been in the United States for 5 years or more, should they stop filing a 1040 NR and start filing a 1040? Is that a legal requirement? Is continuing to file a 1040 NR illegal after 5 years? I think I know the answer to that, but I'll let you touch on that again. My understanding is that it's the Social Security number piece that's important, right?
Yeah, but my understanding is, though, after the 5-year exemption, you would start filing a 1040 because you would become a tax resident. If you were using the exception for those 5 years as an F1 or J1, after that 5th year, you would then become a tax resident because now you've met the substantial presence test by far if you've been here for 5 years straight. So now you're a tax resident of the United States. And that's regardless of whether or not you have a Social Security number or a tax identification number. You're still going to be a tax resident here if you've been here for 5 or 6 straight years.
Okay. But is it illegal? Is it a legal requirement to file a 1040 or is continuing to file a 1040 NR illegal after 5 years? I think illegal is not the right term, but I think they want some guidance around it.
Yeah, my understanding is you're supposed to file a 1040 in the 6th year. You have 5 years of exception for the 1040 NR, and then for the 6th tax year, you would file a 1040 for the substantial presence test. Regardless if you were a green card holder or obviously citizens would file 1040s. But so the answer to that, from what I believe, is yes. You would switch over to 1040 in that 6th year.
Okay. And if the students have been here for less than 5 years, but they have a work eligible SSN number and meet the substantial presence test, they can file a 1040 instead of a 1040 RN?
As far as I'm aware, yes.
Okay. Okay, I think we have time for one more. I'm kind of reading it as I go. Actually, now there's a bunch of questions coming in. I'm an F1 student and have filed taxes for 2017, 2018, but not for 2019. I qualify for the substantial presence test because they arrived in January 2017, and they did receive a stimulus payment. Will they have to return it?
Were they here in 2020?
It doesn't say. I assume they're here now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They would qualify just based off the 2018. If they were a tax resident, 2018 tax return was filed as a 1040, and then they have a work eligible Social Security number, they would be eligible for the stimulus for 2018, even if they don't file a 2019 return. As I mentioned before, you don't need to file a tax return to make you eligible, but that's how the IRS is processing these payments, is based on the last tax return filed. So.
Okay. And is there any, how do you calculate the number of years for tax purposes? Is it a calendar year or a date in year 1 to date in year 2?
It would be the actual tax year itself. So for the 5-year exception, it would be 5 tax years, which might be more than 5 actual years. Is that your question?
No, the question was, I think, how to calculate the number of years. Is it based kind of on calendar year or year 1 to year 2, I think, with respect to the percentages?
Oh, okay. No, it's based on number of days present here in the United States.
Okay. And if you didn't file a 1040 in 2018 and you haven't filed your 2020 taxes yet, or your 2019 taxes yet, and you otherwise meet all of the requirements, are you eligible if you didn't file taxes in 2018?
Yes, you still will be eligible. You should visit the IRS website, search for Get My Stimulus, and then put in the taxpayer identification, Social Security number, and your last known address, and you'll be eligible that way.
Okay. All right. Well, Mr. O'Donnell, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate you participating and helping out SLSO and students of UMass. Thank you all so much for coming and for the great questions. For those of you who aren't following the chat, this recording will be made available on the SLSO website and or Facebook pages, so look out for that. It'll be up in a couple of days. If we weren't able to answer your question during the presentation, or you still need more information or a referral to a tax professional, please feel free to contact the Student Legal Services Office on our website, umass.edu/SLSO. Click on the tab that says Request Services, fill out an intake, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. I hope this information was helpful. Thank you again so much, Mr. O'Donnell, for your time. Thank you all for participating, and have a good day.
Thank you.